Welcome, everyone. I'm Fred Kemp, President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. I am just delighted to welcome you to the fifth installment of Atlantic Council Front Page, our premier live ideas platform for global leaders across all realms. Last week, we heard from the World Food Programme's Executive Director, David Beasley, who warned us of a hunger pandemic that could kill more people than coronavirus itself. Previously, we heard from the IMF Executive Director, Kristalina Georgieva, who made an appeal for global unity in the face of a crisis she called unlike any other. We've heard from two Latin American leaders, Colombian President Ivan Duque and interim Venezuelan President Juan Guaido, who came onto Zoom from an undisclosed location. I think in this case, David, we can safely disclose your location. I'm delighted this week to reach out into the realm of business, financial, and philanthropic leaders with David Rubenstein, co-founder and co-executive chairman of Carlyle. He's a private equity pioneer, a legendary philanthropist, a student of history, a master analyst, and an observer of our times, a keen observer of our times. He's also an author. David, you wrote The American Story, Conversations with Master Historians, and watch for the upcoming book, How to Lead, where David outlines leadership principles and philosophies of people from Jeff Bezos to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So thanks to all of you who are watching and listening in from all around the world, because you are from all around the world, joining this conversation on the impact of COVID-19 now and on the world that will follow. We're hosting on Zoom, but we're also on the Atlantic Council website, and across social media platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. If you want to pose a question, you can do so with the chat function on Zoom, or you can tweet us using hashtag ACFrontPage with your questions. So chat function on Zoom or hashtag ACFrontPage. So David, the one thing I failed to mention in the intro is that I'm also a big fan of your Bloomberg interviews, yet I'm also a little bit intimidated to be interviewing the master interviewer. I told a friend yesterday it would be like shooting hoops with Michael Jordan. So let's begin with the first jump shot. I wonder, it's so nice to come into people's homes. People talk about social distance, but I think it's just physical distance. I think socially we can even grow closer. Can you tell us, you travel a lot usually, can you tell us what you're spending your time on right now, and also what that beautiful piece of art is over your left shoulder?
Okay, well, first let me say, Fred, thank you very much for inviting me. In the 12 years you've been leading the Atlantic Council, you really have taken an organization that probably wasn't as strong as it should have been and made it a much more vibrant organization. So I congratulate you for doing that. And everything you seem to have done has been perfect, except when you invited me, I thought you may have lowered your standards a bit, but I'm very honored to be here. So I live in Bethesda, Maryland, and I lived in this home for some 30 years. I've now spent more time in this home over the last 30 days than I have in the previous 30 years. Behind me is a mural that my late mother-in-law painted about the White House from the 1880s or so. And I had worked in the White House, and I suppose that was a reason that she thought it was appropriate to paint it. And I am coming to you from the dining room of this house. What am I spending my time doing? I'm spending my time doing Zoom meetings, Zoom interviews, where I am interviewed or doing the interviewing. And I hope to do a little interviewing of you today as well. I am also spending some time, reading. I'm doing more time to reading, and I'm doing some writing and trying to get some books done. You know what it's like to get a book done. You have to, have some quiet time. But I would say that I have a little bit of Zoom fatigue, because I'm not sure why. When I run around the world and make speeches or do various things, I don't seem that tired. I am more tired after just sitting in my own living room or dining room doing Zoom meetings all day. I don't know why that tires me out, but I'm sure some PhD paper will be written about why Zoom is more tiring than actually doing things in person. But in any event, I am healthy, and that is the most important thing for my own family and me. We're healthy, and we're grateful for that.
Thank you so much. And for those listening and watching, I just want you to know, even though some of us are feeling Zoom fatigue, this interview will totally reverse that whole feeling, and you'll have Zoom energy just coming out of every one of your pores. So during this COVID-19 period, what's motivating you the most? You have so many different ways that you could look at this.
Well, let me just make a opening comment that may resonate with some people in who are watching. Um, Generally, most people born in my period, I'm 70 years old and born in 1949. And so when people my age have been running the world for a long time, we the baby boomers, and the baby boomers have basically been people who are, the center of the universe in their view for a long time. Tom Brokaw called the people that fought World War II the greatest generation. I've been calling our generation that we're not getting off the main stage generation because we want to run the world, we want to be president, we want to do everything. And I've had that same attitude. I'm saying, why should I slow down? Why should I retire? When I was growing up, people retired at 60 or 65. Now I think maybe 85 or 90 might be a time to slow down. So I've been thinking, I'm no different than I was when I was 60. But all of a sudden with this crisis, people are calling me saying, well, you're a senior citizen, and if you want to go to Whole Foods, you can get in the senior citizen line. So all of a sudden, people are looking at me like I'm, more fragile. But to be honest, I am more fragile because, as we've learned, this crisis is really affecting people in older ages, obviously affecting minorities, particularly as well, but older ages. And so you have to be very, very careful. And the thought that some people may not have had, but I haven't had, I never really thought about my own mortality. I thought, like most people, I'll live forever, or maybe I'll slow down when I'm 90 or something bad will happen when I'm 95. But with this disease, you have to recognize that your mortality is closer than you might have thought. And all of us who are watching, no doubt, know people who have been affected by this disease, who have been injured hurt in the hospital, or they've lost their lives. And so all of a sudden, I'm beginning to think about my own mortality, and I'm very pleased that I'm still healthy. But within 1 week, you could be gone. And so it's a scary prospect to think that you could be healthy, and all of a sudden this disease affects your lungs. And given my age, the age of people like me, you could lose your life. So I am probably rushing to do my bucket list more quickly than I was before.
Thank you for that sobering answer for someone who's not so far behind that. You're also a keen observer in humanity in the more general sense. What do you think, and of history? Some people argue that this period of time really won't have any change on the world. We'll really go back to normal again. Others say this is going to be the Suez moment for U.S. leadership. Everything's going to shift to China now. Some people say we'll get on planes, we won't get on planes. What is your feeling of what kind of permanent impact this could have, this period of time might have on a post-COVID-19 world?
Let me give you an investment analogy. In the investment world, Sir John Templeton, a very famous investor, once said that the most dangerous words in the investment world were "this time is different," which to say when things are good or bad, people would say this is different than before, and we have to be reflective of that when we go forward and take actions. So he said that's a mistake to say that. So I will counter him by saying this time is different. I don't care about what anybody says. This time is different. We've never had a global pandemic combined with a global recession before. And as a result, the combination, plus how global the world is today and how interconnected, this time will affect human conduct and political conduct and all kinds of conduct in ways we couldn't have anticipated. For example, I don't think people are going to rush back to work. Even when it's legally possible for them to do so, many people say, I can work at home just as well. I have kids I have to take care of. There's no place for them to go right now. So I'm going to stay at home. And many people are going to recognize you don't need as much office space as maybe you did before. Maybe people are going to recognize that you don't have to fly around the world as much as you did before. So it's going to change human conduct. In terms of the geopolitical issue you just mentioned, there's no doubt that China has been rising for at least 30 or 40 years. And I do think that you have a situation where the U.S.-China relationship, by far the most important bilateral relationship in the world, is going to change a bit. My fear about the relationship is that between now and 6 months from now, it will go down before it goes up. And this is what I mean. During the presidential campaign and the congressional campaigns, you're going to see people blaming China for a lot of what's happened. Whether that's fair or not is another issue. But I think you're going to see people blaming China because a lot of people in the United States who run for office don't see any downside politically to blaming China. There's not a lot of voters in China, in the United States, who are going to vote in favor of China as much as they're going to vote in favor of the United States. So I think that's going to really hurt the relationship a bit. And I made a speech earlier today to a group in China talking about the fact that I think it's important that we not let the political exigencies overcome us, and we make sure this relationship stays intact. I fear that it won't be good for the next couple of months. But clearly the relationship's going to change, and clearly China's become a more dominant power than it has been.
So, David, let's stick with China for just one moment. Is going to become a more dominant player than it has been. It strikes me, looking at China, that they see this as a seize the COVID moment period of time. And I wonder if you can give me a feeling of whether you think this will accelerate a geopolitical shift. They're going to be the first to emerge back to growth again. They're the first to emerge from COVID-19, and they certainly are out diplomatically and out in many other ways, trying to take over leadership. And sometimes we misunderstand Chinese leadership. We think of leadership as being at the top of the heap. They may think of it more as being at the center of influence and power. So are we really at the beginning of a period of shift to power of China?
Well, I think China has played a bigger role in Europe, in Latin America, in the Middle East, in Africa than they did 30 years ago. And I suspect it will continue because of their economic power. And I think it's not as matter of an ideological thing the way it used to be, communism versus capitalism. I don't think that people that are as worried about the communist effort, the effort of China to spread communism. I think they're just looking at ways they can get money or do business or do other things with China. So I think China will become a much more significant power. And from China's point of view, they were the dominant political, economic power in the world for much of organized history. It's really only been maybe in the last 100 years or so where they fell down compared to where they once were. So I think they just think they're regaining their rightful position as a leader in the world. I think the United States has to recognize we're not as dominant as we once were. After World War II, we were 50% of the world's GDP. Today, we're about 18%. We have 5% of the world's population. So we just can't be and do the things we once did. We can't afford to do them, and we just politically aren't going to be able to get away with doing them.
So let's turn to the economy and turn to debt, something you've talked about a lot in the past. So on the economy, you heard what Jay Powell said yesterday, which drove down markets about significant downside risk, need for more stimulus. We have new jobless figures out today, 3 million more jobless on top of 14.7% from April. So you've said nobody knows how bad the truly is. This week you said nobody knows how bad the economy truly is. How bad could it get? And then I'd like to turn to the debt question, because is the solution, could the solution be, the cure be worse than the disease? You've been talking about debt concerns for years now, and one of the few sounding the alarm before COVID-19, and debt piles are just going to mount even higher.
I have been surprised the stock market's been more resilient or ebullient in certain cases than I would have thought, because the global economy is not in very good shape. We haven't had a situation where you've had the emerging markets, the frontier markets, the developed markets, and developing markets all in a global recession at the same time. That's essentially what we have now. And because we have 30 million people underemployed or unemployed, we've never had anything quite like this. Now, during the Great Depression, you had unemployment of 25 to 30% for over a 4-year period of time. We haven't had it that long yet. But clearly, we are in a word that we don't know yet. It's not a recession. I think it's worse than recession. I don't think it's a depression. There's some word that has to be invented between the two of them. But clearly, it's going to take a while before it comes back. And it's not going to come back in quite the way that people would like. It's not as if all of a sudden the governors say, the states open up, everybody goes back to work, and everybody gets rehired. Many employers have learned that they can get away without as many employees as they once had. And they also realize the businesses are going to come back, so they don't need as many employees for that reason as well. So a lot of people who have been laid off are not going to get their jobs back, unfortunately. Many people who have been furloughed will probably be laid off. And so it's not going to be a pleasant situation. I wish it were, but it's not. And I don't know how long it will go on for, but I suspect we will be in some economic decline of this type for longer period of time than we would like, at least 6 months, maybe 9 months, maybe longer. It'll take a while to recover. On the debt, when I worked in the White House, our last budget, this was under President Carter, was proposing a $59 billion annual deficit. That was thought as too big. We had to pull it back and have a lower deficit. Today, we have trillion-dollar annual deficits as if they're nothing. We were going to have about a 1.2 or $3 trillion deficit. Now it's probably going to be closer to 4 trillion for the year. And so, and that's not even taking into account that we may pass another bill. How are we going to pay for this? It's not something you and I are going to probably have to pay as much for as our children and grandchildren, because at some point we're going to have to pay off what will be roughly, when we're done with this, probably 26 or 27 trillion of indebtedness. Now, we can print money, but that'll produce more inflation, so it's not a good solution. Just keep printing money. It's not there's no easy answer for it. It's something I'm worried about, but obviously getting people back to work is a higher priority at the moment. So if I were in government, I don't know that I have a better answer.
But a lot of it is people still turning to us as the reserve currency, so we're a good investment. Does that go on forever?
It's interesting. The United States has been the reserve currency for, decades, and it's hard to believe, but after all these years, the euro has not really developed into that, and the RMB is not a reserve currency, and the yen is not a reserve currency. So we have the advantage that people who need to buy reserve currencies have to buy dollars, and that has inflated the dollar a little bit. But it's really hurting the emerging markets, because if you are an emerging market country or a company in an emerging market and you've borrowed in dollars, but you earn your money in the local currency, you have a big problem paying that back. And there's going to be a lot of, I think, corporate debt defaults and also country defaults, because people cannot earn the money in their local currency to pay back the rising dollar debt that they owe. So it's going to be a big problem, I believe. I have been surprised that the euro never really became a reserve currency. It tried to, but it really hasn't made it. I don't think it will in the near future.
Thank you, David. I'm going to weave in once in a while some good questions that are coming in. This one's from Darren Hall. David, I'm interested in hearing more from you in regard to how educational institutions will be shaped as a result of COVID-19. Specifically, how will universities across the U.S. cope with financial stress of this crisis? For others listening in, this is a really important aspect of your philanthropy. And so I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yes, I served as the chairman of the board at Duke University for a number of years. I was on the Johns Hopkins board. I'm on the Harvard board and the University of Chicago board. So I spent some time on these issues. Universities are going to change. Most universities will open in the fall, but some will do it online. Some will do it in person, but some will do a combination of it. The universities are still working on it, and they have probably until the end of June to really figure out how exactly they're going to make it work. It's different with graduate students versus undergraduates. Undergraduates live together more closely. It's not as easy to kind of be socially distanced with an undergraduate. Graduate students tend to be able to live in apartments, or maybe they can socially distance or do more online. So I think there'll be that distinction. But universities will change because, one, there's going to be less federal government money, I think, for the research that they do. Second, the tuitions that people are going to be willing to pay or can afford to pay are going to be reduced, and much more need for financial aid than before. The endowments are being impacted because the endowments are down and they feed a lot of the operational costs of universities. So the greatest university system in the world is in the United States, but clearly it's going to be changing, and it's going to take many, many years to get back to where we were just a year ago, unfortunately.
So we've got some terrific people on the line asking questions. This comes from Timothy Worth, Tim Worth. David, thank you for joining the discussion. Have you given thought to emergency authorities, which the president has and which he may use before, during, or after the coming election? Tough question. Maybe you can also talk about how you think this whole period could impact politics in the United States. I think it's been since McKinley that we've had to have someone like Joe Biden campaigning from his home.
Well, let me first, Tim Worth has done a great job as the United States Senator and State Department official. He's obviously a great environmentalist, and I'm happy to try to answer his question. I do think that emergency powers that the president has can be used. He already has certain powers in the Defense Production Act, which he could use. He has chosen not to use them as much as he probably could. But I don't think Congress is likely to give this president a lot of new emergency power, in my view. I think the Democrats are unlikely to give President right now a lot more power. Maybe they should, maybe they shouldn't, but I just think there'll be too much politics to it. I think what Congress is likely to do is not pass so much Emergency Power Act, but provide more money. I suspect there will be sometime in June another $1 trillion bill to help with the states and the local governments with their expenses, and also to maybe deal with liability issues and some of the other programs that have to be dealt with. I think that's more likely to come out of Congress in the near future than additional emergency powers.
The host of this conversation internally at the Atlantic Council is our Global Business and Economics program, and Josh Lipsky is ably leading it as the Director of Programs and Strategy. He's been advancing the idea of fractured growth. So after prolonged period of synchronized global acceleration or deceleration, his view is we may see regions and countries rebound while others remain in recession. That's going to be a difficult situation potentially to manage, particularly with what you're saying about debt. What are your thoughts on what may be the longer lasting impact of this?
Well, clearly, in terms of the economy, I think we've been used to very low unemployment rates. I think that's going to change. Unemployment is going to be higher than we've seen in many, many years. That's probably going to be with us for a while, particularly in some countries like in European countries. I think they'll have higher unemployment than we do in the United States. I think the emerging markets will particularly. I also think that eventually in the emerging markets, you're going to see much more inflation. We haven't had inflation in the United States for quite some time. And even though we're borrowing a lot of money, I don't see a lot of inflation coming in the near term. But I do think that the emerging markets are going to suffer from that because of the problem they have to buy dollars and other related issues. I also think you're going to see more money put into healthcare around the world. And I also think supply chains will be different. The United States was surprised, many people, everybody, how dependent we were on production of materials for the healthcare system in China. And so I think Congress is likely to pass legislation that will make it difficult to be so dependent in the future on foreign countries, China or anybody else, not just for healthcare, but for other emergency kinds of things. So I do think that life will be different, and I think we're going to have to adapt to it. And it may take a couple of years before we get back to where we really want to be. In terms of who's going to suffer the most, and in terms of the economy, I do think the emerging markets are really going to be most hard hit because they have large amounts of debt already. They can't probably pay it off so readily for the reasons I mentioned. I think Western money from Europe and the United States is being pulled out of emerging markets, unfortunately. But I think that's the case. And so you're going to see more and more money from professional investors and large companies going into the developed markets where they think there's a better opportunity to get their money back with a reasonable investment. So, Fred, if I could ask you a question, though. I do some interviewing, as you mentioned, and so I'm unable to be interviewed without asking somebody a question. So first, I'd like to ask you, what is it like to run the Atlantic Council remotely? You signed up for a job 12 years ago. You've done a very good job, as I said, but all of a sudden you're doing it remotely. So is this better, worse, or are you going to continue to do this?
So I was fearing you were going to turn the tables on me. So we'll be shooting some hoops here. The Atlantic Council, a labor of love for me. As you know, I was at the Wall Street Journal for 25 years, and I really didn't think I would ever want to leave journalism for anything. But I came to believe deeply in America's role in the world by watching the end of the Cold War, by watching the role of President Reagan, by watching what good we could do with power properly applied alongside friends and allies. That's what the Atlantic Council stands for. So when COVID-19 hit, we went very early into telework. This is our 9th week of telework. And the team, 14 programs and centers, I've never seen that quick of a transition ever. And there are many things we can actually do better now. For example, we have many thousands of people listening to you right now. Well, in our offices, in our physical space, in brick and mortar, we wouldn't have been able to have that kind of global reach. And we would have done some streaming, but we wouldn't have had this big of a community. We're able to bring together experts on a moment's notice on various things. So that's working better. The team really feels a sense of mission right now. If we don't get this period right, COVID-19, alongside friends and allies, we don't know where American leadership is going to go. You've touched on that. What's hard is the high touch elements of what we do. people like to spend time talking to each other. They like to get to know each other. They like the policize. They like the networking, and that's a lot harder to do here.
So let me ask you a question. You're a specialist in Europe. You've spent a lot of time in living in Europe, and you know a lot about Europe. So do you think Europe has handled COVID-19 better than the United States has?
Some European countries have handled it better. I would say Europe has not. So at a time like this, the disparate countries of Europe would look to Europe for economic unity, political solidarity, for confidence that when something bad happens, you can turn to the European Union. If you're a Spaniard or an Italian, you don't believe that right now, and that's not good for the European Union. They're coming through a little bit more now, but it's a little bit late. Germany is the European leader, but right now the Constitutional Court of Germany has cast a shadow on whether or not they will back the European Central Bank's buying of bonds, so public debt. So I think right now you see Germany handling the virus very well, as you know, quite well. You see other countries like Spain and Italy less well, but Europe as a whole is not coming through the way it should right now.
So if I want to go to Europe for a summer vacation this August, is that going to be possible? And what's the safest place for me to go?
Well, I've heard that Trinidad and Tobago is handling this moment extremely well, and but I think it's going to be a while before we're on a plane to Europe. So let me turn it back on you. Maybe we can go a little bit back and forth. What are you going to do with your summer? How are you looking at the future of the airline industry, the hotel industry, and all of that?
I honestly don't think people are going to travel as much as they did before. I used to travel relentlessly, or rightly or wrongly, and now I just think that people are not going to be welcoming foreign travelers as much. It may be difficult to get visas to go to certain places. And I think until there is a vaccine, I just don't see people traveling as much as they did before. Now, on a vaccine, I think everybody should recognize that while everyone's working on, not everybody, a lot of people are working on it, it's not easy to do and not easy to manufacture. Let me be specific. The Spanish flu, which was not based in Spain, but the great influenza of 1918, we still do not have a vaccine for that particular type of virus. We still do not have a vaccine for HIV. Now, we have therapeutic drugs that if you get HIV can prevent you from getting AIDS, but we actually don't have a vaccine against HIV. So it's not as easy to get these vaccines as you might think. While a lot of people are working on them now, and I hope that many of them come to fruition, I think some of them will, it takes a while. But then you have to manufacture them. It's not that easy to manufacture 1 billion vaccines overnight. So that will take some time. So I think the vaccines will be around eventually, but I just don't think it's probably going to be here by summer that everybody can be vaccinated. And I think that's a reason why I don't think you'll see as much travel. And I think you'll see a lot more remote kind of operations like this. But let me turn it on you in terms of Europe. So you were specialized in Europe over many years. Since World War II, who has been the most important leader of Europe, in your view, in guiding Europe to where it is today? Is there one person that you think has been the dominant person in Europe and is the person who deserves credit or blame for where Europe is today?
So I'm a big Helmut Kohl fan, and I think he's one of the most underestimated political leaders of our time, and certainly underestimated in Germany. Everyone takes for granted that the Soviet Union has fallen and communism is gone, but we were armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons. There was a divided Europe and a wall running through that divided Europe and divided Berlin. And Helmut Kohl negotiated an outcome with Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader, successfully because he was joined at the hip with the United States. And he knew that was the only way to go. That was not the instinct of his foreign minister, Hans-Dietrich Genscher. So I think he kept Europe unified when it could have fallen apart. He gave up the Deutsche Mark for the euro. And without him and without his work with George H.W. Bush, President Bush, I don't think we would have had a peaceful German unification and end of the Cold War, my view.
So let me mention a book that I am reading now called The Splendid and the Vile by Erik Larson. You may have heard of it. It's a book about a great leader, Winston Churchill, during 1940, and how Winston Churchill with relatively modest military resources and financial resources, managed to keep Britain alive until the United States ultimately came into the war and helped win that war. Do you have a view on Winston Churchill in terms of his leadership ability compared to other leaders you've observed over the years? Was he so much better than other European leaders, or was his publicity better?
I think the times played into all of his great talents. And after the war, then he wasn't as great a leader any longer, but also his intellect, his painting. This is one of the most fascinating politicians of all time. But tell me what else you're reading. I know you're reading that. You and I talk about books once in a while. What is on your list at the moment?
Well, let me mention two books that people might find interesting. One is a book called Spillover by David Quammen. I've interviewed him recently. This is basically the leading book that's been written. It was written, I think, in 2012, about how increasingly animals and humans are intersecting in ways they didn't before. Because we have 7.5 billion people on the face of the earth, we are spending more time in habitats that we didn't occupy before. Mining, deforestation, other kinds of things, buying more animals for eating or hunting or other purposes. And the result is more and more we are getting viruses that live in these animals that escape, and ultimately they come into humans. And this is probably what happened in the wet market, I suspect, in Wuhan. And so it's a very interesting book to learn about how this problem is going to be with us for some time. A second book is The Great Influenza by John Barry. And this talks about the influenza that we're all familiar with now, called the Spanish flu, which happened in 1918. And roughly 50 to 100 million people around the world were killed. In the United States, probably something close to 700,000. And interestingly, the conclusion of John Barry's book is that the government made a gigantic mistake by not telling people the truth. In fact, Woodrow Wilson, the president, never once mentioned the flu in any speech. He ultimately got the flu when he was at the Paris Peace Conference, and it really hurt him significantly. But the public officials were afraid of talking about it then. They thought it would hurt our war effort. But the conclusion of John Barry's book is that you've got to be open with people and honest. The conclusion of David Quammen's book is that you need to recognize we're going to have more and more of these viruses unless we figure out a way to get better vaccinations, better vaccines, and also learn how to escape things like the infections that often come from bats, which are very often the principal source of many of these viruses.
So since you're talking about books at this point, let's talk about your new book. Gina Wood of the Atlantic Council actually is asking to hear a little bit more about it. What has prompted you? Let's do it in two parts. First of all, what's prompted you to take on this life of interviewing, and particularly interviewing so many leaders? What have you learned about leaders, and what are you putting in that book that's really valuable for us to know?
Like most things in life that happen that are good or sometimes bad, it happens by serendipity. I didn't say, well, I've been a lawyer, I've been an investor, now I want to be an interviewer. It didn't happen that way. I was asked by Vernon Jordan to succeed him as the president of the Economic Club of Washington. My job was to get people to speak. And after doing that, I realized many business people were, let's say, boring speakers. So I decided to interview them and make it maybe a little bit more interesting, throwing in a little humor. And it caught on. And now I've been doing it for about 12 years. And then Bloomberg saw it and they said, why don't you do it on television and so forth. So what I try to do when I interview leaders is ask them what makes them tick, what makes them leaders. I've always been interested in what makes people rise above what they might have had before in circumstances and become a leader. And it's a lot of different stories. So I took some of the interviews I've done of leading business leaders like Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates or Warren Buffett, or military leaders like Colin Powell, David Petraeus, or people like Jim Baker, or cultural figures like Renee Fleming or Yo-Yo Ma, and asked them how did they become leaders. And essentially I edited down the transcripts and I've given my own views on what leadership is. And in my view, to be a leader, you need to be willing to take criticism. You need to be willing to fail. You need to be willing to not take no for an answer. You have to be willing to be persistent. You have to have some vision of where you're going. You have to be willing to share the credit. You have to be willing to be honest and ethical. And you have to be somebody that I think knows how to communicate. So you can't be a leader without followers. And the best way to get followers is learn how to communicate orally, learn how to communicate by writing. But the best way is to lead by example. You do something and other people will follow you. So the book is kind of the summary of my views on leadership and leadership lessons from other people. And thank you very much for letting me talk about it. So let me ask
Well,
you a question, though.
okay. As long as I get 10% commission on those book sales I just generated.
All the proceeds go to Johns Hopkins Children's Center. So there's no
Okay.
proceeds for the authors.
As
So,
it should be.
I'm the chairman of the Kennedy Center, as you probably know, and I've done that for a long time. And I've been attracted to that because I like the performing arts, but I also admired President Kennedy. Elected at 43, unfortunately, tragically assassinated at 46. But you've written a book about his time in Vienna, where he had a very famous meeting with Nikita Khrushchev. And that was a meeting where John Kennedy didn't perform as well, in his own view, as he should have. What was the essence of the meeting? Why did it not go well for John Kennedy?
Thank you for that question. So the book's called Berlin 1961. And my view is that 1961 was one of the worst first years of any modern presidency, of any presidency. So he had the Bay of Pigs fiasco first, and then he went into the Vienna summit almost as an antidote to the problems he had at the Bay of Pigs. So first of all, Bay of Pigs is April, June summit, and he's 43 years old, youngest president ever elected in the United States, following the oldest president, who was Eisenhower. He goes to Vienna not very well prepared, a little bit self-confident, thinking he's going to meet this peasant, in his late 60s, Khrushchev. There's nothing Khrushchev is going to be able to do that's going to surprise me. I'll be able to handle this. And he was clearly overconfident. By his own account to Scotty Reston, the famous journalist Scotty Reston, at the end of the two-day meeting, he thought it was disastrous. And he was confident going away on the flight, going away from Vienna, that Khrushchev was going to test him, and test him soon, which of course he did in Berlin in August, just a little bit later.
So in hindsight, do you think that Kennedy could have done something to be better prepared for his meeting with Khrushchev? And in hindsight, as you look at President Kennedy and your experience, was the Bay of Pigs the worst moment of his presidency, or the best moment? The worst because it failed, or the best because he decided not to follow through with military troops that might have had even a bigger loss?
What an interesting question. I didn't study Bay of Pigs deeply, but I guess you could look at it as both, whether it was the worst moment of his presidency to then, but then it shifted him. But it's the beginning. People ask, was he a great president? Was he not a great president? And I think he was only a president for 3 years. He never had a second term. So my own answer is we'll never know, because what would he have done with Vietnam? What would we have done with a number of other things? What we do know is that in August, the Berlin Wall went up. And what my book is, it tells the story of what I thought was Kennedy's complicity in that. And the documents show that he thought by allowing Khrushchev and the East Germans to shut that border, to stop their refugee flow, he was going to create a safer world. And then he would be able to engage in nuclear talks with the Soviets in a safer world. It is certainly a premise that you could argue, and I understand why he argued it that way. We found out a year later, a little bit more than a year later, in October of 1962, that didn't turn out to be true. That then turned out to be Kennedy's best moment, which was the Cuban Missile Crisis. But without the signs of weakness he showed Khrushchev in Vienna and at the Berlin, during the Berlin crisis, or Berlin Wall crisis, my own view, and I think the documents support this, Khrushchev never would have risked putting missiles into Cuba. But then Kennedy did rise to the occasion, and that was the point at which the Cold War became a little bit more locked into patterns and a little bit less dangerous.
So as somebody who studies Europe a lot and who's lived in Europe a lot, is Brexit actually going to go into effect? I know that they're kind of passed legislation that says they're going to go into Brexit, but they haven't really reached an agreement yet. And is COVID going to change Brexit? Which way will England go in the future? Are they going to be more inclined to do Brexit or less inclined?
Well, I'll answer that, but then I want to throw it back to you, because you may know more about this one than I do. And I also want to know whether you think Europe is a going concern and a great investment, or whether you'd shy away from it. But my answer on Brexit is, I think there are a lot of people in England right now looking at Europe and being a bit relieved that they pulled out. I was against Brexit. I thought for the country's own interests, and certainly for American interests, and certainly for European interests, it was better for the UK to stay in. But I think people now are looking at this and looking at Europe's performance during this crisis thus far. And it would be really interesting to do this referendum all over right now to see how they would stay. But I think the real issue to watch right now is what happens with Northern Ireland, what happens with Scotland. Will the UK actually stay together? Or is this a fundamental shift where the UK itself gets called into question over time?
As a place to invest, I think Europe is very interesting in this respect. It's a developed market economy, obviously, and next to the United States, I would say the most developed market economy, leaving Japan out for a moment. And so, but you have to look at Europe as different countries. Clearly, investing in Germany is different than investing in, let's say, Spain. Investing in England is different than investing in Portugal. So you have to be specific about which country. But what I have found is that one of the most appealing things until COVID-19, we'll have to assess whether this is true in the future, is this. Europe has great products, great design. You want a great German designed manufacturing product, for example. But you might want it to be manufactured to some extent in Asia. But you might want it to be sold in the United States. So very often we've looked at companies where you have great Italian design products or great German design products, but they're really manufactured in lower cost areas, and then they're sold in big markets, very often China or the United States or back in Western Europe. So I do think Europe will continue to be an attractive place to invest, but you do have to recognize that European economy going forward is not going to be as strong as the United States, in my view, because the euro is not as strong, and because the reason you just mentioned, the ECB, while it's led by a terrific person, Christine Lagarde, does not have quite the same authority that maybe it should have to do everything that it really wants to do to help the European economy.
So I have a question here from the Philippine ambassador. Let me just say one more thing about Europe before I pass on. I think what a lot of Americans forget is our stake in Europe's success. So the European Union project, its 70th anniversary was last week, ended war, ended centuries of war, the European coal and steel community. Its strength and its holding together is in our vital interest, in our vital national interest. And I really do hope we find our way back to a vivid understanding of that and an even more dynamic alliance and relationship with European neighbors. There's a good question here from the Philippine ambassador to the US. How would Kennedy be handling the coronavirus crisis right now? And how would he negotiate with Xi Jinping?
Well, let me answer the question first with a anecdote about that type of question. One time, Mikhail Gorbachev went to the Kennedy School at Harvard, and he was asked by a student, Mr. Gorbachev, if Nikita Khrushchev had been assassinated on November 22nd, 1963, rather than President Kennedy, how would the world be different? How would the world be different? And without missing a beat, Mr. Gorbachev said, well, of course, you can't really say how the world would be different. But one thing I can say for certain is that Aristotle Onassis would not have married Mrs. Khrushchev. So to answer your question, I would say President Kennedy was a young person to be president. When you think about it today, 43, it does seem young because many of the people running for president or going to be president are in their 70s. And when you mentioned Eisenhower, I remember as a young boy looking at pictures of Eisenhower, I said, boy, this is an old man. Well, I now realize I'm older than Eisenhower was when he left office. He was elected at 62, he left at 70. So the world changes a bit. I think President Kennedy was somebody that brought in a lot of very smart people. They made some mistakes. Obviously, I think Vietnam was something that it was probably a mistake. A lot of his advisors urged him to do more there and so forth. But I think that President Kennedy would have probably consulted a lot of advisors and asked people their views and probably listened to a lot of them. But in the end, he would retain the final decision. But it's hard to know how he would have dealt with this crisis because in those days, the world was so much different. And the world was not quite as connected as it is today. So it's hard to say, but it's a very good question. And I just wish I had a better answer, but I don't know. I'd like to say that he would do a wonderful job, but you just don't know.
So this is such a great, fun conversation and also fascinating, and also important. Let me throw two questions that have come in. One of them is about CEOs. You were talking about leadership. Let's switch it to CEOs. Richard Edelman's on our board. He just put out a trust barometer showing the trust in government institutions has gone sky high. Whether it lasts or not, who knows, from COVID-19. But the trust in CEOs only edged up a little bit, and he sees warning chimes for CEOs who may not have done enough here yet. And then the second current question, but I'm going to hold on to that for a second, is quite different on reserve currencies and digital.
Okay.
Sorry, the digital. So let's go first to the first
on
question.
CEOs. I think CEOs have actually done a reasonably good job. Now, as a former CEO of Carlyle, I'm now the executive chair, but as a former CEO, it's not easy being a CEO of a publicly traded company, lots of different constituencies and so forth. But I think CEOs have really stepped up. They are working around the clock to try to make sure their employees are healthy and to make sure that their customers are healthy and that they do everything to make certain that their business can operate. Remember, who would have thought that you'd be operating these companies all remotely just 4 or 5 months ago? So I think they've done a pretty good job. And I'd say that when surveys are done in a couple months, I suspect governors will come out probably on the top. Then I suspect CEOs will come out pretty well also. But we'll see what happens there. But I think CEOs are doing a pretty good job. When I interview them, they are basically telling me they're working 7 days a week because it's not like they can escape home anymore because their home is their office now. And so they don't travel so much. So they have more time to actually work on things day to day. And everybody thinks they're accessible. So I think I've done a pretty good job. Remember, managing a company in this environment is not easy, particularly when a lot of your sales go away. So, for example, I'm going to interview Monday the CEO of United Airlines. Well, how would you like to be the CEO of United Airlines or any airline today? It's not easy. Not easy at all. So on reserve currencies, there was a reserve currency question.
Well, yeah, it's really going from reserve currencies to digital currencies. And do you think we need a digital dollar backed by the Federal Reserve? This is from our own Josh Lipsky.
Right. Well, I cannot say that I think that's likely to happen anytime soon. But if I were to come back and be alive 50 years from today, I'd be surprised if there are any paper currencies anymore. 50 years from today, I suspect everything will be digital. But the transition to a digital currency will take some time. And I don't think the Federal Reserve is likely to do something like that in a crisis like now when uncertainty is what we don't want. And we don't know how those kind of things will work. So you mentioned earlier Helmut Kohl, and I would say, let me just comment on him. I do think that he did a terrific job in helping to bring together the United Germany. As you may recall, there was opposition to it. Margaret Thatcher was not really in favor of it. George Bush was pushing for it, and it happened relatively peacefully, and it was not easy at the time. I did go over with George Herbert Walker Bush one time for, I think, the celebration of the 10th anniversary of the uniting of George Herbert Walker Bush and I and others went over. And John Major, who was involved in our firm one time, told me a story about Helmut Kohl. So, Pete, maybe I'll get in trouble for this, but John Major said that one time when he was the prime minister, he had a meeting with Helmut Kohl and with Mr. Yeltsin. And Mr. Yeltsin insisted that they go into a sauna together. And so they proceeded to do so. And John Major said, well, one thing, it's one thing to help your country, but one thing that you probably don't want to do is see what it's like to be in a sauna with Helmut Kohl and Mr. Yeltsin. It wasn't a pretty sight, he said. But anyway, they got their project resolved, maybe because they bonded together in the sauna.
There's a wonderful exchange of letters over Christmas between Helmut Kohl and George H.W. Bush, where Helmut Kohl sends Bush a bunch of bratwurst and Christmas cakes and various things, and really thanks him for the trust, because without the trust, the history wouldn't have been made. Question here from Amy Parker. What role, and this is crucial, I know you think about this so much, what role can philanthropy play during this time? And what advice would you give to other philanthropists at this time?
All philanthropists are basically struggling with this issue. How can you have an impact? We always want to have an impact when we're giving away money or giving away our time and our energy. And I like to remind people that philanthropy is a derivative of an ancient Greek word. It means loving humanity. It doesn't just mean writing checks. You can love humanity with giving your time, your energy, and your ideas. But all philanthropists that I talk to, and myself, I basically say, what are we doing that's relevant? I've been supporting lots of projects, but they may not be the most important thing today. So I have been shifting a number of my philanthropic efforts to things more relevant to probably what the problems are today. So food banks, food kitchens, things that make certain that people have food, make certain they have healthcare equipment and so forth. And I've been very pleased that many other philanthropists are also shifting and doing much more the things that today are of immediate import. It's a sad, sad situation in our country. Who would have ever thought 3 months ago that you have miles and miles of cars waiting to get basic food? Now, we've had food banks in our country for a long time, and we've had homeless shelters, but middle class people have never had to experience the hunger of not having food or the inability to put food on the table in quite the way we've had since World War II. And so I would say this is a tragic situation. And I think many philanthropists are trying to gear up to give away the money they have for these kind of purposes. Though I recognize that all philanthropists probably have less money to give away because the economy is less than it once was in terms of the value of their holdings. Let me ask you a question, though, about the Atlantic Council. How do you expect the Atlantic Council will come out of this? Will it be stronger, be weaker? What will you change in the Atlantic Council? Are you going to let people work remotely forever, as some people are now saying is going to happen? Or are you going to force everybody to come back? And what is the standard when they come back? Do they have to have masks, socially distanced? How are you going to resolve that?
Well, if we were not a nonprofit, and if you had bought into us as an IPO 12 years ago, you'd finally be a wealthy man, David, because we've been so successful over that period of time. But we are a nonprofit. We do reinvest our money into our good works, but we have been the fastest growing in our space over the last 12 years because we have a clear purpose, which is shaping the global future together with friends and allies. That's what we do. We have a way of operating, which is entrepreneurial, intellectual entrepreneurialism, results-oriented, where possible, measurable results. We are doing, knock on very hard on wood right now. We're doing extremely well. We're doing well during this period of time. Our donors have stayed with us. Our projects are going forward. We're operating in a digital space in many respects even more effectively. So. And the only thing I'm worried about is we are as strong as the Atlantic Council has ever been, but the challenges for us and for our passion of U.S. global leadership alongside friends and allies to shape the future has never been as challenged. So that's a big challenge.
So I ask people this all the time, and I'll ask you, as a result of this crisis, what have you learned about yourself, good or bad?
I've learned that I'm an ambivert, which means I love being in the office and I love being at our big events, but I actually sort of like working in this room, having some quiet to think things through and get things done. The other thing is I've come to think more about space. What is office space for? What is its best use? How is the best way to learn to guide a team? As you said, leadership. I'm learning from the team right now. I'm learning a lot from what I'm hearing bubbling up from the team, so that's exciting to me. We're getting near the end, and I have two more very David Rubenstein questions. Can I throw them at you? Okay. And then maybe we go 2 or 3 minutes over because I want to end with one question for you too, and you may have one more for me. And this just shows what a global community we brought together, David. So Mohammed El-Bey asks about private equity. Private equity firms have built up substantial dry powder over the last few years. Are they looking at markets down 10, 30% and looking to buy aggressively, or still telling their teams to stay defensive? Second question, and this is from Ashish Lakanpal. Ashish, great to hear from you. What are your thoughts on how capitalism evolves in the post-COVID world?
Okay, on the first question, private equity firms do have a lot of dry powder. And the reason is they raise a lot of money when times are very good and they have this money available to them. But the most important thing they're doing right now is shoring up the companies they own. That we learned in the last recession that the best way to make a lot of money is to make certain the companies you already own are okay and survive. And therefore, you may have to put more equity in or buy debt back, maybe at a discount. And once you've resolved your existing problems and dealt with those, then I think there is money that is going to be used to buy companies that people didn't previously have in their portfolios. We've already seen some of this, where industries that are really hard hit are now getting a fair amount of private equity money in form of preferred shares and so forth. And I think you'll see much more of that over the next year or so. And in terms of capitalism itself, well, capitalism is always under challenge by people around the world who don't like the capitalist system. And capitalism has lots of imperfections, believe me. It's not a perfect system, a lot of income inequality as a result of it and so forth. But I do think, as Winston Churchill famously said about democracy, it's the best system. It's the worst system, but there's no better system than this one. In effect, paraphrasing him, I think capitalism will be. We'll do okay out as a result of this, because I do think that the capitalist system will survive this okay, though the help of a lot of government involvement in the economy. I hope that we won't basically see the government taking over major industries and doing that on a permanent basis, destroying the entrepreneurial incentive and the capitalist incentive. But I think capitalism will have its challenges for sure. So let me ask you a question, though, which is, now you're self-isolating with a 12-year-old. So now, what have you learned from a 12-year-old about self-isolating? Is this a good thing? And is your daughter happy to be doing this, or what?
I love that question. So the main thing I've heard about self-isolating with a 12-year-old is there are complications with her schoolroom being next to the office. And so for events like this, we move her schoolroom downstairs just to nasty. The other thing I've learned is it's great to have a dog. And what we've really seen is a bonding process of child to dog. When you don't have play dates, your family also grows enormously closer. And so that's also a wonderful, wonderful.
Now, you've been running the council for 12 years, right?
I have.
And your daughter's 12 years old.
That's right.
So when you got the job running the council, it got you so excited, you said, I need to have a child. Is that right?
Well, I'm not sure whether I'm going to save the world or raise the child more effectively. We'll see. We'll see how it turns out. But but I think there are complications with both in the micro and the macro sense. So I think we're just about out of time. Do you have another question? I have a closing one for you.
No, I just wanted to conclude with, before your final question, to say that I appreciate everybody's listening who did listen. And the most important thing, the message I want to convey to everybody, is that life is fragile. And we're very fortunate to be living in a time when we have the means to avoid this particular problem, social distancing, among other things. So I hope everybody will not make reckless mistakes and not prematurely think that they're healthy and safe forever, because this virus is very virulent and it can do great damage. So please be careful and don't take risks.
David, thank you for that. So and this last question is ending on an optimistic note, and in the frame of getting some advice from you to someone to say who is 35 right now, just lost a job, or maybe somebody who's trying to build the kind of life you built. So you grew up in a low-income home in Baltimore, son of a mailman and a stay-at-home mom. Your father dropped his high school to go to World War II. Your mother dropped high school and got married. Your story is such an inspirational story. If you were you at that time in this COVID-19 period, what advice would you give to your younger self? And what advice would you give in general to a person who's graduated during the financial crisis or graduated now and trying to start a life of success these times?
A couple of things is, you can't plan your life. You never know where it's going to go. So don't worry about where you're going to be at 60. Worry about where you're going to be in another couple of years or so, not 60. Don't plan your whole life out. Experiment. Try different things. I tried many different things. You have to find something you love. Nobody ever won a Nobel Prize doing what they hate. You have to love what you're doing to be good at it. So find things that you love doing with a passion. And if you can find that, that's terrific. But also, you need to make certain that you're trying to do something to make the world a better place. There's no point in making a lot of money or having a lot of material possessions if you're not doing something to make the world a better place. We're only on this earth for a short period of time. Try to do something that will make your family, your children, your grandchildren, your parents proud that you did something useful with your life, more than just making money or just getting material possessions. Doing something useful with your life is the greatest pleasure you can get.
David, thank you for that close. I'm the son of German immigrants. I believe in the American dream. You embody the American dream. This has just been a wonderful conversation. Thank you for taking the time.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.